Okay, so finishing out my review of the PDF. So let's look at student barriers. So student barriers are an example would be language barriers or lack of motivation at the time of assessment. Assessment context barriers such as noise distractions or poor lighting, things that are really out of our control but definitely warrant consideration in assessment. Assessment barriers such as vague directions or missing information, even if it's something as simple as, our copy machine not printing out the full directions or the full answer choices for a question. This needs to be a critique and an aspect of our critique of our own assessments as we shape those in our classroom. Multiple choice barriers, written response barriers, performance assessment barriers, and personal communication barriers are each their own category of barriers because each of these forms of assessment do have certain hindrances and obstacles which may arise. So multiple choice, for example, you could have incorrect bubbling or incorrect scoring key, which I think are two things that are really important to think about. Response barriers, we can think about lack of writing skills on the student's part, but then also for teachers, we may not allow ourselves sufficient time to really read and score patiently, which I think is really important, and just giving our students our all and allowing students to succeed as best they can, and that they deserve the time for us to read and score patiently their written responses, as tough as that may be sometimes, as busy as we are as teachers. Then performance assessment, we think about unfocused or biased tasks, which I think bias can occur in all of these categories. And then lastly, personal communication barriers, such as problems with accurate record keeping and sampling enough of student performance. So I think back, to my excitement about having student conferences to use personal communication to assess. Well, I need to make sure that I give enough time in each conference to sample enough of student performance to assess them accurately, because students need enough time to demonstrate their knowledge, and they deserve that. So moving into our fourth stage, administration of the assessment. This is found on page 117. So I thought something that really was important here, something that really struck me in this part of the cycle, is that we must remember to never begin the assessment development at this stage. An example of this may be just administering a textbook provided test. And I know this is very tempting for teachers, and multiple times in high school I had just a textbook test, but taking the time to go through these stages 1, 2, and 3 to really just grant students the best form of assessment that they can have through the target match method and through understanding our students is really important here. Lastly, in the cycle is our revision stage of the assessment, and I think a lot of times this is skipped because after the assessment's over, we as teachers just grade it and then don't really look back. But I think revision is really important because we need to double check that the assessment did accomplish what we intended to. And I think a lot of times, as much as we, hope and think that our assessments will be successful, a lot of times they're not. We need to check for sources of bias, which may have appeared as stated on page 117. And if something does go wrong, there are two main plan of actions here. We either do not need to use the results from that task, or we need to interpret the results from that task with a bias in mind, whether that means scaling things, just really keeping that hindrance in mind as we revise and rework our assessment. And then the thing that I really love throughout this entire cycle is to consider asking for students' help in this. I'm excited to have that open line of communication with my students to understand, what worked about my assessment for y'all? Where did y'all feel like y'all really didn't understand what I was asking for? And then on the flip side of that, where did you feel like you really got to demonstrate your knowledge and that I really gave you an outlet to succeed here in the assessment? So in closing my review of the PDF, I researched this quote by Dylan William, who is a British educationalist. And he states, when teachers do formative assessment effectively, students learn at roughly double the rate than they do without it. And this is really encouraging for me because a lot of times I think that assessment does have such negative connotations, but I think that articles like this and quotes like this encourage us to realize the value that assessment has in the classroom, and the value that assessment can add to students even in their learning and in their functioning in the classroom. So thank you so much for listening to my review with me.